a speech with Mr. Priyadarshi Dutta. Priyadarshi Dutta is the author of The Microphone Men: How Orators Created a Modern India, the first book to trace the genesis and growth of public speaking in India and its relationship with growth of civilian politics. Born in Chandir Nagar, West Bengal, formerly a French colony, he has lived most of his life in New Delhi. He has been writing regularly in a national newspaper Viz, the pioneer on national and international issues since 2001. Mr. Datta is currently a consultant with the Election Commission of India, having earlierly worked with Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and also he was the Rajya Sabha Secretariat and Embassy of Egypt, etc. He has also written poems in Hindi and short stories in Bengal. Handing over this session to you, Mr. Datta.
Shall I speak from here, or I think I can? I think I need to quote something from the book once in a while. So I think I should let me speak from here. I think it is so.
So please sit.
Sitting there?
Yeah. So just for photograph, then you can.
Just for a photograph?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect, sir.
I think, one of the ways you might have, why I was insisting on standing there, because that is the standard body language of person who gives speeches, you have heard. But it was Gandhiji who brought out a change in the body language. Most of his speeches, you see, Gandhiji was seated, and the microphone was adjusted to his height. And the only person in the 20th century, apart from Gandhi, had used that, there was another person to have used that, a body language. But Gandhiji, if you see, that was not the body language of a speaker. It was the body language of a saint. And if you see the speeches of Gandhi, they are also not a political speeches. They were mostly ethical discourses in a sense. And Swami Vivekananda, though he was a saint, he delivered all his speeches standing. So this is the very Gandhiji brought about a change in the Indian political discourse, first by choosing a body language of a saint, and he repositioned public speaking. So there is a definite difference between the standing and seated. So Gandhiji felt that whatever he wanted to speak was best could be said while seated. So I do not know whether I am very comfortable or not while speaking. So I believe that can I stand up and deliver the speech by standing here? I think my ideas would float better from there. Huh? So it will be better if I speak from here, if I just come down to the stage. So good morning, everybody. I am delighted to come to this city, Nagpur, which 100 years ago, 1920, brought about a great change in the structure of that great umbrella party called Congress, which was mostly a talk shop and a think tank before 1920. And when the Nagpur Congress was held here in the year 1920, a few months after the great doyen of Indian public figure, Lokmanya Tilak, Gandhiji brought about a great change that he formed various organizations and units inside the Congress so as to look a mini government, and which in the ensuing 27 years actually came to resemble a huge organization like a banyan tree. So all that actually began somewhere in the December, right from this month in the year 1920. So this is, I happen to write a book called The Microphone Men: How the Orators Created a Modern India. While writing this book, the idea that I had in mind was that, you must have come across the history of journalism, which is at least taught in the institutes of mass communication. But there was no history of public speaking or oratory. People were not convinced either that oratory or public speaking could at all be a subject amenable to history. This is because we often feel that public speaking is a sort of an art and it has come down to us from the ancient past. They actually mistake public speaking with the faculty of speaking. But the very faculty of speaking, which is natural to human being and at least goes back to the time of the development of languages, is not same as public speaking. At least in the case of journalism, you see a palpable intervention of the printing press. When printing press came to India in the 19th century, journalism, or in the 18th century, journalism began shortly afterwards. The English newspapers came sometimes in the last quarter of the 18th century, the Bengal Gazette, from which the concept of gazette actually came. It was actually in the name of a newspaper. And then Samachar Darpan, all it came in 1818. But you see, there is a technology. But public speaking, you can find that it does not need a technology at all, not even a microphone. Microphone actually came to India much later, in the 1920s. But why do we see in India that public speaking and journalism growing simultaneously, beginning from somewhere, journalism beginning somewhere, Indian language journalism beginning somewhere in the second decade of the 19th century, and public speaking from the fourth decade onwards? Now, this is because India was going through a churning process under the British rule. And it was this process that made our transition to a civilian politics from a military-based politics. Now, what could be a best place to understand this from the very history of Maharashtra? You see, Maharashtra played the great role in the history of India in two very different phases. One phase began with the rise of Shivaji, and it later on with Bajirao I, and it came somewhat degenerate, but ended in 1818 with the Third Anglo-Maratha War. That is all about swords and warlike fighting. But there was no development of culture, languages, even architecture at that time. You see another phase in Maharashtra beginning with Bal Shastri Jambekar, whom I said he was the first modern Marathi, and who was associated with the newly born Elphinstone College, which was then called the Elphinstone Institution. And in that Maharashtra, you find many of the persons who actually dominated the civilian politics of India. Not all of them were Marathi, because it began from what is now called Mumbai and then called Bombay. There were Gujaratis, there were the Parsis, and there were, of course, Marathis also. But Pune, in a more specific term, was a city that was completely dominated by the Marathis, especially by the Marathi Brahmins. And there you find the rising of the giants, like first came Justice Ranade, then his student Gokhale, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and then, of course, Lokmanya Tilak. In the first, you see, it was the war, horses, and the sword that was dominating the history. And here you find newspaper and the microphone, or the public speech, that was shaping a new kind of history that is called the civilian politics. The extent of the first was, as it said, of the Maratha Empire from Attak to Cuttack. The extent of the second was much larger, because, almost 7 times or more, Gokhale had gone to England. Of course, Justice Ranade, his guru, could never go there. But Gokhale went many times in his brief life of around 48 years or so, 7 times he went to England. Tilak also went to. So its extent is much larger, even much larger than India itself, even the international stage. But how this change was brought about, it was not relevant only to Maharashtra, but to the entire India. This is something very significant in the making of a modern India. So the 2 provinces that I found that had played a very important role in the making of modern India was, of course, Bengal and Maharashtra. Now, incidentally, the city where I live, although I come from Bengal, which had been in the vanguard of the growth of modern politics, Delhi, you see, where I have lived most of my life, unfortunately had no role to play, and only one session of Indian National Congress in the entire pre-independent period was held there. But if you see in what is called today's Maharashtra, then it was a part of Bombay Presidency, you find so many sessions of Indian National Congress in Bombay, in Pune, in Nagpur, and Amravati. These two provinces played a very important role like the engine of the new national consciousness that was taking place, and in rest of the provinces it picked up only in the first decade of the 20th century. Of course, Madras had also played a great amount of role, because in the 1885, when the first session of Congress took place, it was the Madras presidency, which then included today's Andhra Pradesh, etc., sent the maximum number of delegates to that session there. But however, the growth of civilian politics antedated the birth of Congress by several decades. It actually started with the public speakers. The journalists were, of course, there. But you see, the journalist alone cannot shape modern politics, because journalist is a person who writes in a newspaper. He or she writes actually from behind a curtain, as they say. People rarely get to see them. Although it is true that in those days, many of the great leaders had their own newspaper. Gandhiji has his Young India. Of course, the Madan Mohan Malviya had Abhyuday, and Tilak had the Kesari and the Maratha. But that did not make them political leaders. The political leaders are actually those who can come on the stage and say to something in the public, look to them in eye to eye, and can take responsibility there and then for whatever they say. So our modern politics was entirely built with the public speakers, and you can see still the importance of public speaking, which our current Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, has brought to the fore, whereas the public speaking, which was losing sheen, was again repositioned in the public life. But public speaking had been very important right from the 19th century, even before the political leaders were born. Actually, public speaking, if you see, I would concentrate, it would first started, the first public speech, which presupposes a public meeting, first started, the first speech I could locate in 1829. In that, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Prince Dwarkanath Tagore, who was the grandfather of poet Rabindranath Tagore, together delivered a speech. That speech was, in fact, in the somewhat favorable to the indigo cultivators. Had they made that speech 20 years later, they would probably have been beaten up by the public. But at that time, the reaction was mixed. But more importantly, what they said, the medium that they used was more important. It was another December in 1829, because you might remember that famous saying that medium is the message. So when they said they brought about a new message, the medium was more important. And it was actually, they were bringing a new medium of mass communication that was called public speaking, was being born on the Indian stage. But Raja Ram Mohan Roy played a more seminal role in bringing out that public speaking. How? He was the first person in India, he was the very first person in India to write about contemporary issues, analytical articles in contemporary issues, and he was the first person, or the first generation of person, who spoke actually about in prose language. So it is the prose, the development of the prose in India, that actually could sustain this new culture of public speaking. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the first. He is more known as for his campaign against Sati and for the creation of the Brahmo Samaj, or the Brahmo Sabha that was known in his days. But actually, he was the first Indian to write about, let's say, judicial reforms, revenue reforms, rights of the women in the share of property, writing in the 1820s. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy was actually the person, he was the visionary of modern India in that sense. There Raja Ram Mohan Roy, we find, was the pioneer. Now, after Raja Ram Mohan Roy, he died shortly afterwards while in his first and only visit to England. Then after Raja Ram Mohan Roy, there was Prince Dwarkanath Tagore, who carried on the furrow for some times. And in the 1840s, something great happened. In the late 1840s, something happened in a college which was then called Elphinstone Institute in Bombay, now Mumbai. In the hall of their college, there used to be discussions and debates on contemporary issues, and there was a teacher there called Naroji Fardunji, who acted as a mentor to many of the students. And one of the students of his was Dadabhai Naroji. Dadabhai Naroji became the first professor of mathematics, first Indian full professor anywhere in India. And he was a professor of mathematics. He, in his 20s, was responsible for organizing various meetings. And in 1852, the first meeting of the Bombay Association took place in the hall of the Elphinstone College. And present there was Dadabhai Naroji, present there was many other top leaders of the Parsi society, like Nimse Manekji. There was, of course, Jagannath Sankar Sheth, who was a very important person of this time, Dinanathji. All these persons were there. Dadabhai Naroji shortly left Bombay and he went away to, he resigned from his job and he went away to England. In England, he had gone there. Kama and Company, had set up actually a business firm there, and he was a partner. Now, while there, he was still a partner in the Kama and Company. He did not like the business model there, and he went on to make an organization there in London which was called East India Association. Although it was representing whole of India, that was the first time in the history of India that an organization, there was a British Indian organization also in Calcutta, although it is still existing, although it has nothing to do with the British. It was the first organization of all Indians. So a pan-Indian organization which had membership from all over India was actually formed in London in 1860, around 1861. Who were the persons behind them? The persons behind them were Dadabhai Naroji, and there were his students. His students were, who were his students? His students was his students means they had gone to study law there. Their students were Firoz Shah Mehta and W.C. Banerjee. Interestingly, 20 years later, W.C. Banerjee, Firoz Shah Mehta, and Dadabhai Naroji, all of them became Congress presidents. And actually, it was the Shishya or the student who became the president of Congress first, and then his guru, Dadabhai Naroji, became the president of the second Congress. But all that was 20 years later. So they antedated the modern politics of India by almost 20 years, or of the Congress politics by 20 years. But what was the actually, how public speaking became so important? It was so important because, you see, it was the growth of public meetings like this. Now, before 1840s in Bengal, people thought a public speaker is a person who has his own duties to mend, and he has to go out mending the business of the country. And but they were not really interested. But why suddenly the people became so interested? I don't think at the time of Shivaji, if somebody had delivered a lecture, people would have come to hear him. Of course, it may be a religious discourse. People would have come to listen to him, but not a political lecture. And I don't think if Shivaji Maharaj had, adopted a resolution and sent it to Aurangzeb to take a more liberal policy on religion, Aurangzeb would have heard, or Aurangzeb would have agreed to that. At that time, it was only sword had to be met with the sword. I mean, that was the overall political discourse of the country. Either you lose or you win, but it was the sword was the arbitrator of politics. But after the British rule came, you see all the Indian princely state, even though they remained a princely state till 1947, and some of them, including Nagpur, which was actually taken over by the British, they brought about what is called, the Indians were slowly what is called disarmed in a sense. No princely state could make war against another princely state. They could not send any representative to abroad. And the British anyway brought about an end to invasions from abroad. So in one sense, howsoever iniquitous was the British rule, which Dadabhai Naoroji first stated in India, but there was a sort of a general law and order. And the new Indian class, which learnt English language, and English language actually gave them a window onto the world. The English language also was a very modern language in which you could have new kinds of literature like the essays, like statistics, like parliamentary debates of England. So the new class that came in India, grew up in India, learnt it was on all this virtues. So it was Dadabhai Naoroji, like I said, he was, for example, the first person to use statistics in public speaking and in his writing. I mean, today a lot of statistics is being used in India, but all that began actually with Dadabhai Naoroji. Similarly, another thing that the public speaker were trained at was law. If you see the bar at law, or the barristers or the lawyers played a disproportionate role in the shaping of the Indian politics. Some of them, many of the examples come from, of course, from Maharashtra, like it was Justice Ranade, like what is Rao Sahib Vishwanath Rao Mandlik, and all others. And then came, of course, Firod Shah Mehta, and all others. They were all lawyers by profession. Why the lawyers? Because lawyers could understand law better, and they could actually reply to the policies of the British by understanding them in their same coins. So this is how actually modern law, actually the people who were dressed in modern law played a great role in the shaping of a modern Indian politics. Another thing came with the British. It was the legislation. Now, what is legislation, you know? Legislation is the art of lawmaking. Lawmaking means that there is an assembly or there is a parliament in England at that time. Later on came the councils and legislative bodies in India, which were, even to do some rules, they have to pass a new law. And that law has to be done according to the principles which can stand the of the courts. So lawmaking or legislation is a very important subject in the running of a modern governance and remains till date. And at the end of every session of parliament, the government claims that we pass so many laws in the parliament. Or even at the date of every assembly session in different states, the government says we pass these many laws. Now, ordinary people don't understand what will these laws actually are and what will they do. But actually in the modern state, if you have to do something, this has to be not arbitrary by the fancy of the ruler, but they have to be based on a certain kind of a law. And this has to be a written law which has to be passed as a bill. The bill has to be passed, an act has to be published in the Gazette. Now, in law, a single line or a single sentence can make a lot of difference. If you don't understand that, something could be passed very different from the intention. So, those who are actually the modern, taught in a very modern political science or in the law, they actually were the first to understand the importance of legislations. And many of the public meetings in the 19th century were actually actuated by the passage of the new laws. Whether these laws were passed in the Viceregal Council in Calcutta, or they were, you have here also the Legislative Council at that time, it now called Legislative Assembly, then called Legislative Council in Bombay. So these laws made a difference in the people. You have to a people, those who are properly educated, they can understand the import of every law and that you are not cheated, that every sentence is in order, and if that law had to be amended in the future, what shall be the course? So all this went through the debates. So you'd see a debate going on inside the Legislative Council and also in the public meetings. And why people came to the public meetings? Now, here there is an incident that in the 1890s, when Surendranath Banerjee returned from Calcutta, in those days there were no aeroplanes and people had to return by ship. It was a long journey, but of course by the steamship. So when he came to Bombay, he had to reach there at around 3 o'clock. Now, from 1 a.m., from 1 p.m., people had started taking their seats. And when he reached, almost all of it was full. And for the first time, I believe it was so much crowded that police had to be called in. And there was almost a balcony there overlooking the Dhobi Talao. Some people felt that if the crowd became more and oppressive, the balcony could actually collapse. So a police had to be brought in to manage the crowds. Nowadays, interestingly, if you have to organize any public meeting, you have to first inform the police, the law enforcing agencies, to see the bandobast. But in those days, actually, the police did not trouble the public speakers at all. But people had a fascination for public speaking, which began in the late 19th century, and the public speakers became the new hero. And as the railway came, in India, somewhere around the railway network expanded in the 1860s onwards, you find Surendranath Banerjee, who was a great orator of that time, and he became the first Indian pan-national leader because he used the train. He came to the Bombay presidency, he came to Madras presidency, he went up to Lahore at that time, and he founded small organizations wherever he went, modeled upon his own organization, the Indian Association, which later on played a great role in shaping of the Indian National Congress. So what happened that due to the growth of the Indian railways, 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, it became very easy for the public speakers from travel from one part to one part of India. For example, when the first session of Congress was held in 1885, it was about to be held in Pune. So all delegates were advised to reach up to Pune railway station, and from there they will be taken to the Parvati Hill, which used to be the residence of the erstwhile Peshwas. Now it got cancelled due to cholera, and the session took place actually in Bombay. Now, a person from Bengal was the president there, W.C. Banerjee. In the second Congress, who was the president? The president was Dadabhai Naoroji from Bombay presidency in a Congress that took place in Calcutta. The third Congress took place in Madras, and there were again a person from the Bombay presidency, Badruddin Tayyabji, who became the president. So you see, without the railways, these public speakers could not have actually built up a pan-Indian discourse through their public speaking. Although public speaking came first and the railways later, but it was actually the railways that created a pan-Indian discourse. And when Gandhiji came, he could crisscross one part of India for the other because that was 1915. And if Gandhiji had become a national leader, the railways really played a great role in shaping of that, because the railway had expanded by the second decade of the 20th century. So there we see the role of the railways. Now, but the more important thing of public speaking is that the public speakers are all on the stage. Now, on the other side is the crowd or the listeners. Now, they are also more important. Generally, you see the listeners are there only to listen. But it is to send out a message to the government that, listen, whatever we say in a public meeting is not our personal opinion, but there are so many people who are coming to our meetings. That means there is a public opinion. Public opinion could, of course, be built through the newspaper, but when you have a public meeting, and even today, the strength of the attendance of the public meetings actually determines the popularity of the leader in many senses. Of course, now you have the broadcasting machinery, you have the TV, you have the webcast and all other things. Much before that came the radio. Of course, the radio was in the British hand at that time. So speeches could reach out to different parts of India. Now, but is to say that those who have come to listen to the speech, they might be silent, they might be spectator. Yes, they might ask questions, they might clap, they might cheer, but they are with us. So what the public speakers are saying is not just their individual cogitations or the musings, it is also to state that the people are actually with them. That is what the public speaker meant to say, that we represent the nation. So, and whatever they were saying to the British, that they know the British may do or may not do. But however, there is a public mood for this. And when Gandhiji came to India in 1915, and from I think 16 or 17 onwards, he started delivering some of his political speeches. So Gandhiji brought a new mantra. That mantra was that previously the public speakers used to listen to come to the meetings and then go away. Now Gandhiji said, no, you have to do something in between. Then he gave that charkha. So that charkha came, somehow Gandhiji discovered charkha in the 1918, and he said when people go back to their home, they should spin the charkha. The charkha may be producing some actually some of a fabric which was hand cut and hand produced. But that is not more the important thing. While spinning the charkha, you have to feel that you are working for the nation. What you produce is not important. So your mindset is important, that you are some way connected to the nation. And this is actually the thread of the nation. So Gandhiji, through that charkha, built up something which was called the mass movement. Before Gandhiji, there was hardly any mass movement except in the transient phase of the Bengal, anti-Bengal partition movement. But Gandhiji built up a mass movement, and in that mass movement, speech was also necessary. So Gandhiji had to deliver a lot of speech. Somewhere around the 1926, he said that he had to speak a lot. So on Monday, he would keep a day of silence. Many people, he later on clothed it with various kinds of spiritual thoughts, and he said that, this had some spiritual values, but actually he had to speak too much, and he wanted to take a weekly day off. So that he said to Louis Fisher that actually I want to take a rest from speaking, so I had to keep my Maun Brat or day of silence where I would only write. With Gandhiji, we see another change come. But although he was not a pioneer, but he made it a national factor. That was speaking in a non-English language. All the 19th century orators mostly spoke in English. The first change was brought about by Lokmanya Tilak. In his Maharashtra or the Deccan Relief campaign that he did, there was actually a famine in Maharashtra, mostly the Sholapur districts and all others, in 1897. So Tilak Maharaj set up a group of people around him with the various kind of thing. He took a college graduate, a lawyer, an ambulant, a cow protector, an astrologer. He trained them all that you go from village to village, speak to the masses in your own language, which is Marathi, and tell them that there is a famine relief code formed 20 years ago, and people should not be forced to give that land tax in case there is no production of crop, and there is a famine, of course. There was no crop then. So actually what happened, he actually set up the first, what you call, speaking in a Indian language or the vernacular language. Some 20 years later, when Gandhiji came, he was a changed person. Gandhiji, as you know, was for 24 years out of India. Out of India means he was there for a year in England, and then and he was in South Africa. He used to visit India once and often. He came twice, but the latest by 1901. And he used to deliver some speech in very good English. But in 1915, when he landed in the Bombay's Apollo Bandar, a day which is now celebrated 9th of January, I believe, 1915, he landed in a different cloth. It was he went a Kathiawadi headgear. He had an Indian kind of a cloth, just a plain cloth. And he was a new person. And he said then onwards, He would like to speak mostly in an Indian languages, which could be Hindi, which could be Gujarati, and I think he knew several other languages to some extent. And actually, he brought about a decolonization of Indian mind, that the actual battle for India was not with the legislative councils, where the people has to clash the sword with their knowledge of law. We have to reach out to the people of India, to the masses, and speak in their language. It was actually started by Tilak, but only in Maharashtra in the late 19th century, but it was taken by Gandhiji to the other parts of India. And he made it an instrument of the mass, of a mass movement. So there lies the importance of Gandhiji's contribution. But I think there were people who were actually suspecting or in doubt about the efficiency of public speaking. Now there was a person, Basudev Balwant Phadke, who was the first revolutionary of India. He actually began as a public speaker and used to openly say that he was going to deliver a speech in Shaniwarwada ground of Pune to how to drive out the British. But then finding that his public speeches were not making the people to rebel, he actually came to a social organizer, and many of the things that we today go by, of the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, these were actually instituted by Vasudev Balwant Phadke, whether it is Prabhat Feri, whether it is various units. And then he became a full-fledged revolutionary. Of course, there he failed there, and he passed away in Eden in captivity in 1883. But he was a modern-looking man. He worked in the British government, and he knew English. But then came the Chapekar brothers. The Chapekar brothers were a study in contrast. They actually came from a family who had been of a kirtan singer, and they did not like the modern thing. So they said, nobody in the world had become independent by delivering speeches. They say what the Congress do, they do a thing like, there was a tele-serial called Office. Congress was merely passing resolution. Congress was merely playing speech, and resolution. So he said no. So he first started actually the cult of the killing, which he did by killing of Rand, who was a plague commissioner then. But in the 20th century, we find another great revolutionary, and I come to the last part of my speech, Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose actually was for 20 years a Congress leader, a disciplined congressman wearing khadi. Then in a most unceremonious way, junked by Gandhiji, he had to leave Congress and start Forward Bloc. And then he went away to Germany and then to Japan. And from there, he had to communicate with the Indians. Of course, he tried to lead a military front, which became INA. But he had to communicate with the Indians. Now, how could he communicate with the Indians at that time? In the 1930s came the shortwave radios. With shortwaves, actually, you could transmit your voice from one continent to the other, thousands of miles. The shortwave radio, whatever Subhash Chandra Bose set up, a free Indian government first in Germany, Free India Center, and whatever used to say on Azad Hind radio used to be recorded from that Philips radio broadcasting center somewhere in Netherlands. He used to broadcast his speeches, which used to reach in India, and they used to reach even to Singapore. Captain Sarnawaz Khan had said that. Rashbihari Bose, who was another great revolutionary, but for 30 years living in Japan, he also tried to do that from Singapore. So in that radio speech was the final phase of the growth of the Indian public speaking. Also in the last phase, we see that something happened, which was our great orators of the 19th century and early 20th century did not even think about. That was the high decibel that was the high decibel campaign for the achievement of Pakistan by the Muslim League. That campaign was accompanied by very vicious kind of speeches, delivered well in Urdu, in Hindustani and all others. But of course, their leader was a person called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who had earlier been a great constitutionalist. And Jinnah, the only language Jinnah could speak and write with a great degree of certainty was English. In fact, that was the only language he was good at using. So Jinnah, when he was a constitutionalist, was not a public orator, but he was a good speaker otherwise in councils, in small meetings. But suddenly Jinnah became the leader, 1937 onward, of the Muslim League. And whatever Jinnah used to say, deliver the public speeches, they were all in English, which most of the Muslims could not understand. There were other leaders like Muhammad Khan Mamdod, Firoz Shah Noon. They used to speak in other Urdu languages and all others. But those speeches were so vicious and so divisive that there was a person who, I'm not able to recall his name, but he wrote the book called The House That Mr. Jinnah Built. So he said it is better that in a Sholapur Congress, most of the Muslims did not understand that speech. Otherwise, there would have been a great bloodbath. But when speeches were not sufficient, Jinnah gave a call for if we can't divide India, we will have it destroyed. So he mixed again blood with politics on a larger scale. The great Calcutta killing took place, and then the riots in Multan and all other places in the western Punjab took place. So somewhere have we reached, when Muslim League came about, that what could not be achieved through speech could be achieved through mass riot on this scale. And the only thing Jinnah could say, he could not communicate with the masses except through English, which the general Muslim masses did not understand. But only thing he took over was that he was wearing a tunic, a pajama and sherwani in an exchange. Earlier he used to wear three-piece suits. So that was the Muslim League people could feel that, that sartorial design they could relate. But whatever Jinnah was saying, most of the Muslim masses could not understand at all. Yet they came to throng to listen to him. That means there was something apart from the language itself in the public speaking. So when that finally Pakistan was achieved, I think public speaking was put to a use in the Subhash Chandra Bose and Rash Bihari Bose made it an instrument of the war, because the INA and the Azad Hind Fauj, as it later on known as, was actually an instrument of war for independence through military means, but public speaking was a part of it. Jinnah, of course, Pakistan also, public speaking was a part of the Pakistan movement, but it was in such a manner that our earlier public speaker would never in their nightmare could thought about that this would one day happen, that public speaking in India would be used for shedding blood. But anyway, after the Pakistan partition happened, India again became independent, and again public speaking was put to a very peaceful use, like framing our constitution, like going out to the masses, like in the election campaigns, the public speaking was used. So we have found that public speaking had played a great role in shaping of constitutional politics, in mass politics, and in building of a modern India, an India which is very different from earlier times. And today public speaking has not lost its utility. 1996 onward, when I do not know, you were very young, but in 1996 we saw the first televised debate of a parliamentary debate when the Vajpayee government sought the trust for a 13-day government. From that time onwards, parliament speeches were also being televised. So now when an MP speaks in the parliament, he is not just addressing the house, he is addressing almost the entire nation. So public speaking has not really lost its importance, even with the growth of social media today. You see today many of the speeches have come even on the WhatsApp or on the social media. So public speeches and many conclaves are organized. So public speaking, I feel, will continue to have attraction with the masses, and it will go on shaping the history of India, many chapters of which are still to be written. So thank you. Thank you. Oh. If you have any question, is there time for it, a question, or we are running short of time? 5 minutes. If you have any question, you can put if you have. Do you have any questions? No? I think none then. Okay, thank you.
Sir, I